Alrighty, y'all. You're going to need to stick with me because I've now been doing this theory crafting for about 9 hours on stream. And you can also check me live on Twitch or YouTube if you like to watch the long streams. You can go back and check this if you want to see all the logic that went into it. But here's what I have for you. I've come up with a pure minions build, a blood surge normal and with minions build, a blood lance build, a blight build and a blight build with minions, a sever build and a sever build with minions, an Infinimist build and an Infinimist build with minions, a bone spirit hybrid with and without minions, bone spirit with and without minions, and bone spear with and without minions. Here's the generalized concept. What you're going to see in the planners are the aspects that I think are probably going to be pretty good for the build, along with the uniques. I didn't include any uber uniques because I don't assume we'll be able to get them in the PTR. And the whole concept was taking a look at the game as it currently is, trying to incorporate all of the changes that we've seen thus far in the PTR, patch notes that we have gotten, and just guess at what builds are going to look at and basically what I want to test throughout the PTR. I basically think that there will be very strong pure minion builds. What I have for you is a Fishymancer build, so it's minions with corpse explosion, minions for single target, corpse explosion for AoE damage, etc., etc., and how to incorporate the changes and what we should be looking out for. Do I think that this is what the builds are going to look like at the end of the day when we're done with the PTR and walking into the season? Absolutely not. These are your best guesses at what each one of them is vaguely going to look like. So what I recommend is using the timestamps, go to each one of the individual builds that you wanted to test out. The only build where I don't have a modifier or a variant with minions in it is Bloodlance. There's no way to fit them in there. I don't care. I tried so hard. We sat here thinking for a very, very long time. There's no way to do it. But I wanted to get everybody a generalized roadmap of things to try out that should probably bare minimum function and more optimally work in a way that shows us the strengths of these changes, so that when we're looking to update build guides and create new build guides for the season itself, we have a much better idea of what to look like. So I'm basically just going to go in order of the builds as they are right here and give you a quick rundown of what to think about. I have skill trees for you. I have Paragon boards for you. Obviously, we don't have the seasonal mechanic. And again, they're not going to have stats on them because we don't know what stats are going to be in the game. But these are my best guesses at what you should generally expect out of these builds in a functional way. And for the people who don't like listening to me ramble throughout a video, in the Discord, I have a full link to all of these planners here. Every single one of them that you're going to see in this video is included in the Discord. The link to the Discord is down in the description. If people can't find their way over to the Discord, I'll also just link all of these in a pinned comment at the top of the video. So again, if you're looking for a particular one where you want to hear the logic, jump to that timestamp. If you just want to see the build planners and kind of mess around with them yourselves, here are the links. Please come join the Discord. We have a bunch of cool people in there doing a bunch of testing over the PTR. The more people, the better. But let's go ahead and get into it. We're going to start off with the Fishymancer. This is corpse explosion and minions. Basically, like in Diablo 2, your minions are just meat shields. They're there to create as many corpses as possible. The Golem actually does damage. Army of the Dead is a big finisher that actually does damage for a single target. And then Corpse Explosion is your AoE damage here. The idea is that the minions do single target, we do AoE. You can clear through screens, and then they generate enough corpses consistently enough to be able to use Corpse Explosion damage against bosses, so it doesn't feel too bad. And remember, again, I'm going to go through this very quickly. Check the build planner down below if you want to see it in slower detail or go over it in more in minutia. But Disobedience to handle the fact that we need total armor and survivability, Heart and Bones for both of our DRs. I'm going with Reanimation as an additional multiplier of their damage. If we actually need more attack speed and we don't get enough from Kalan's Edict as well as from our gear to reach the 100% cap of the Cult Leader Legendary node, then we would have to use Frenzied Dead here. I'm going with Protector because I can't think of a different survivability aspect that would go into our pants. Maybe the dodge one that auto heals you when you dodge. Who knows? That one's a little bit up in the air. Flicker Step to actually reduce the cooldown of Army of the Dead. Black River to give us huge multiplier for Corpse Explosion damage, along with Sacrilegious Soul to automate Corpse Explosion, as well as automate resummoning our skeletons and casting Skeletal Priest. We're going with Occult Dominion to give us +3 to warriors and +3 to mages on our amulet. And then on our other ring, we're going with Grasping Veins. We may not need the critical strike chance here, so you can actually put Frenzy Dead if we don't need it. The 1.4 damage multiplier is pretty good, though. It's hard to beat that with any other aspects that are available. And then Unyielding Commander on a focus for more CDR to be able to bring Army of the Dead CDR down as fast as possible. For the Book of the Dead, since this is a minion build, we're going with Reapers generate corpses, we're going with Shadow Mages fire an additional bolt, and then we're going with Bone Golem. This will actually now say whenever you use your activation, make 5 corpses. That's 1 free, fully powered corpse explosion from Black River every single time that the Golem's cooldown comes off. The skill tree, I'm not going to go into exceptional detail because this is something that you're just going to have to look at in the planner. We don't care about this skill, we just need 3 points, Hued Flesh to be able to generate corpses, maxing out Corpse Explosion, maxing out Fueled by Death, along with just a single point into Spiked Armor. We just don't have more points, but then maxing out Skeletal Mastery. Then we're doing Amplify Damage. We're getting all the way down to Abhorrent Decrepify. We're picking up Maximum Death's Embrace, Maximum Death's Approach for movement speed, and then maxing out Skeleton Mage for their damage. Just the 1 point into Corpse Tendrils, along with Vulnerable from Plagued. I am going with Necrotic Carapace for Fortify because they made it very clear that damage reduction is going to be very hard to come by. So I think that having at least the 10% from being fortified is going to do a lot more than it used to. Then we're doing Army of the Dead all the way up to Supreme Army of the Dead, maxing out Golem Mastery, maxing out Inspiring Leader, Hellbent Commander, as well as Death's Defense. I don't think that you're going to need Bonded in Essence in any way, shape, or form. And then we're picking up Kalan's Edict, obviously. I'm not going to go over the Paragon board of every single build because that would be insane. Most notably, I'm just picking up Amplify, Dead Razor, Mage, Control, Essence, and Golem. You might ask, why not Skeletal Warrior? It just turns out the Skeletal Warriors aren't really going to be doing damage on this build. They're mostly there for utility, and I just could not fit in another glyph, even as a minimum investment, and still get good returns on the other glyphs that would actually scale damage well. Okay, on to Blood Surge here. Blood Surge was a little bit harder to basically figure out what would be optimal for it, and the long and short of it is this random pair of gloves is representative of the new unique gloves, Cruor's Embrace. I don't think that Cruor's Embrace will actually be good for the build, but I know a lot of people are going to want to try it, so I took my best stab at how that would work and actually incorporate it and get the most benefit out of it. We're going with Juggernaut for armor, we're going with Shielding Storm to generate barrier from our Lidless Wall with Bone Storm, Cruor's Embrace, like I just said, Blood Moon. The interesting part about Blood Moon here is it's going to see a lot more play in the minion build, but obviously as its biggest multiplier on the build, this is just absolutely fantastic. Plus the DR from cursed targets is a really hard, and actually only a single source has this type of DR, and I think it's going to go a really long way for increasing the survivability of builds that can use this. Wind Striker on the boots, we're going with Accelerating on the weapon, we are putting Rathman's Vigor onto the amulet. You might ask, why not Banished Lord's Talisman? And now that they've nerfed it, you actually just get better returns on a normal legendary amulet, again depending on what stats are available. If it turns out that Banished Lords even outperforms normal legendary amulets, which I highly doubt, we would swap that back over to here and then end up putting this down onto a ring. We are going at Grasping Veins. Grasping Veins is still a good multiplier even if we don't need the crit chance, but there's a good chance that we don't need the crit chance, and then you end up swapping this out. And then Blood Bathed, obviously, with Lidless Wall to finish it off. The idea here is that you most predominantly use Hemorrhage to be able to generate essence against single targets, whereas being able to generate essence on kill from the new affix on gear will be a really good way of maintaining that throughout packs of monsters. We obviously want to be spamming Blood Surge as often as possible. Decrepify for a massive amount of overall multipliers here. Corpse Tendrils for continued crowd control. Bone Storm for everything that Bone Storm does. And then we still need a source of Unstoppable, so Blood Mist is going to fill in here. On Blood builds, it's particularly powerful since every single time they overpower, it reduces its cooldown, so you basically have it up whenever you want it. On the base version of the build, we are still sacrificing Skirmishers along with Bone Mages and then Iron Golems. This depends on what the stats look like in the Book of the Dead because we didn't see any changes there. I think they're generally just buffing them, so it should be safe to still use these. For the skill tree, we do want to pick out Hemorrhage all the way up to max Fortify. If you want it to happen faster, you can just use attack speed, but I like being able to max out Fortify here since it's a little bit harder on Blood Surge. Obviously maxing out Imperfectly Balanced, Blood Surge, as well as Paranormal to get the Overpower procs, and then Hued Flesh. There is a universe where we need to max out Hued Flesh because Cruors will need more corpses than we can generate. And I think that if we max out our critical strike chance, we won't need Inspiring Leader, and that's where we would take one of the points to put it over to here. For Blood Mist, we're not generating corpses. If we don't need the crit chance from Inspiring Leader at all, I would like to pick up being able to generate corpses because it's really important to be able to use Corpse Tendrils on demand, and I would like to see it here. If Essence isn't a problem, we could take 2 points out of Grim Harvest and instead put it up to Ghastly to generate those corpses. But for now, we're using that as a primary way of automating Essence generation, and then Fueled by Death for the multiplier. Here, Decrepify all the way down to Abhorrent, obviously maxing out Amplified Damage, and then Death's Embrace. If I could find points, I would obviously like to pick up Death's Approach for more movement speed, but there's a universe where we may not need it. maxing out the 3 most important skills for the blood passives, and then only a single point into gruesome mending, picking up corpse tendrils to apply vulnerable, and then down here inspiring leader if we need the crit chance, then obviously standalone for a very important source of damage reduction. You're going to hear me hammer on this a lot, but DR is going to be very hard to come by in season 4, and I think that standalone has just skyrocketed in value. And then the 3 points into Memento Mori for the better sacrifice bonuses, obviously Bone Storm with Supreme Bone Storm, and then Rathma's Vigor. Again, not going over the Paragon boards in excruciating detail, you can check it out in the planner, but we're picking up Sacrificial, Corporeal, Dominate, Essence, and then Territorial for another much needed DR source, considering again it's going to be harder to come by. The biggest change to incorporate minions is continuing to use Cruor's Embrace, and then using our minions to generate enough corpses for it to be relevant, and then we are using Deathspeaker's Amulet. Do I think this is good? No. Is it worth testing though, because the damage value on this amulet theoretically should increase with scaling now that they're changing how that's working? Obviously, yes. I think that being able to trigger a bunch of novas from Death Speakers and then a bunch of novas from the Cruor's Embrace will help to increase the amount of damage that you lose from just running the build as a pure Blood Surge Necromancer. The important thing to notice here is that we do not have a curse on our bar, but because Blood Moon Breaches can apply curses via our minions, and we are using minions, I'm hoping that we can rely on that to get Decrepify and Iron Maiden up as often as possible to continue to benefit from the pants themselves. If it turns out that you just can't, I don't think there's a lot of hope for this build in general, but we're running Reapers Generate Corpses along with the Shadow Mages will increase your damage per Shadow Mage that you have so that we can recoup some of the losses from not sacrificing them. And then you'll notice that we're not using a Golem because we just can't fit it in. While you could drop Blood Mist because the Golem's Unstoppable will now be able to give you Unstoppable whenever you activate it. And you could use Blood Golem to regain 30% DR, which is not a terrible option. I think that losing the multiplier from the Iron Golem is just too much to give up to incorporate a less than viable additional minion that we really can't invest in. The notable things here is that it's going to be very similar to what we built before. Obviously, we have to invest at least into Skeletal Warrior Mastery as well as Skeletal Mage Mastery so that they can actually survive and potentially do some damage. We did recoup some of the points from not having to put our points into Standalone and Memento Mori to be able to pick up generating corpses from Blood Mist. We are still building into the corpse consumption package because Cruor's Embrace will eat the corpses for us that our minions generate, so we can basically use that for free. And then here, we're not putting the points into Abhorrent Decrepify. We really don't have cooldowns that we need to worry about there, and that gives us enough points to be able to build into other things more effectively. And then everything else in the skill tree remains the same and still building down into Rathma's Vigor. The big change in this Paragon board is that we do have to at least build into a minimum investment Cult Leader with the Dead Razor glyph to be able to get the damage reduction that I think you will need for your minions to actually survive without fully investing them in other ways. Other than that, we basically just lost some of the additional damage from our Paragon board to make way over to that glyph, and nothing else has really changed. We did swap over to Corporeal as opposed to Amplify, since this will also give us movement speed from our minions, and it has a more continuous uptime of damage since Blood Surge's damage is all physical. Bloodlance is mostly unchanged other than the fact that the nerfs both to Tybalt's Will as well as Bloodlord's Talisman basically just reduced your overall damage output and makes us more reliant on things like Blood Moon Breaches for that same damage boost. It's a very straightforward build here, nothing really that crazy. We're going with Juggernaut for the armor, we're going with Shielding Storm for the barrier gen, we are going with Grasping Veins. If we don't need the crit chance, we can swap this out to something else, but at least for right now, it's a pretty decent keep. Blood Moon Breaches for the massive damage multiplier there, Wind Striker for movement speed, Gore Quills to be able to trigger off of all of our blood orbs so that we don't have to go pick them up, Hungry Blood on a ring so that we can propagate a ton of blood lances into packs of monsters more efficiently than Gore Quills, Potent Blood so that we can actually manage resources. At the end game, you really don't need this anymore once you have Starless Skies and Resource Gen on gear, but this one will at least make sure that you are functional in the game that we'll be able to test in the PTR. Rathma is chosen on the Amulet, and then Lilith's Wall to top it all off. Still sacrificing Skirmishers for the crit chance, Bone Mages for the additional overpower damage, and then Iron Golem for the crit damage. Skill tree here basically completely resembles that what it normally would. We are picking up Hemorrhage with additional attack speed since we don't really need to over fortify since Bloodlance does such a good job for us. We're obviously building into Supernatural Bloodlance, maxing out Imperfectly Balanced, and then Hued Flesh to be able to trigger corpses so that we can proactively corpse tendrils whenever necessary. Only the 1 point into Blood Mist, since we just need it as an unstoppable source. We do have the points to be able to max out Amplify damage, Decrepify all the way down to Abhorrent Decrepify, just to help with Bone Storm uptime against single targets, and then Death's Embrace for the DR, and then Death's Approach for the movement speed. We are maxing out everything in the blood passives that matter, Corpse Tendrils and generating blood orbs from Corpse Tendrils via Blighted, and then Inspiring Leader, Standalone, and Memento Mori. Bone Storm all the way through, and then Rathma's Vigor. For the Paragon boards, we're going with Sacrificial, Corporeal, Dominate, Essence, and Territorial. You'll notice that this looks a lot like our Blood Surge boards, and it's because they're basically the exact same. We do have additional points though, so we are willing to build over into Blood Begets Blood for the additional damage multiplier from whenever we pick up Blood Orbs. Like I said, there's no minion version of this build because you can't fit minions onto Bloodlands. If somebody finds out a way to do it, please let me know, share a planner with me, come into the Discord and tell me about it. I'd love to hear about it. But I got the best minds here sitting in chat for Blood, and there's just no good way to do it. Getting into the shadow builds, we are going to start off with Blight. Blight, really similar to what it looks like before, except obviously we have the new amulet, the Ebon Piercer. So that's why you're going to see a naked amulet right here. The idea is that you would go get that. The reason why it should be so much more powerful is because it's adding on additional projectiles that I believe are going to work by applying a damage over time effect to the targets as opposed to a pool underneath them, which allows us to stack more procs and have the ability to trigger lucky hit and just overall increase our damage output, as well as how quickly we're able to reestablish Blighted aspect via our Shadow Blight procs as well. So for this build, we're going with Void so that our Blight will pull in monsters, Shielding Storm for the barrier gen. We're going with Damned as a huge damage multiplier now that you only need to apply one curse. It's absolutely insane the amount of work that Decrepify does on darkness builds now. Juggernaut for our armor total, Ghostwalkers on the boots, since we should be able to cast Blood Mist whenever we want and just generally enjoy a huge amount of movement speed there. We're going with Ultimate Shadow so that Bone Storm is relevant to our build. Ebon Piercer, like I said, the unique amulet. Sacrilegious Soul to be able to automate a lot of our corpse explosion damage as well as just procs in general, and then Blighted for the huge damage multiplier, rounding it all off with Lidless Wall for survivability. For our minions, we're sacrificing Reapers for the shadow damage, Cold for the vulnerable damage, and then Blood for the maximum life. Quick little behind the scenes here, this is why we can actually fit a Golem into the minions version of this build, because there's not really good sacrifices for a damage over time build. You could go with attack speed now that we're a little bit more choked for it if you personally would like to do that, and I don't think that it's wrong, but I'm personally building for survivability right now since I think it's going to be a lot harder in the PTR than it has been previously. For the skill tree, not much different than anything that we've seen before, obviously maxing out Blight as well as the supernatural Blight. We don't use a generator, maxing out Imperfectly Balanced along with Hewed Flesh, and then you'll see that we are maxing out Corpse Explosion for its damage over time along with Blighted Corpse Explosion, just the 1 point into Blood Mist for the Unstoppable. Building down to Fueled by Death, but only 1 point in Grim Harvest. You shouldn't really have essence issues on Blight. Then we're building into Abhorrent Decrepify, the 3 points into Amp Damage, and I only had 1 point to be able to put into Death's Embrace. I would like to max this out. And it kind of depends on whether or not we need to max out Reaper's Pursuit for mobility. If we don't, we can put those 2 points over here for the survivability and the better damage output. Corpse Tendrils and applying Vulnerable. You notice we only put the 1 point into Crippling Darkness here. While this is generally good on Sever, which can actually scale the instance of damage here, we only need the 1 point just to be able to stagger bosses more quickly. We are still maxing out Gloom as well as Terror. You'll notice I'm not putting points into Inspiring Leaders since we don't need crit chance. We don't do crit damage. And then we have the 3 points in Standalone, Memento Mori, and then Bone Storm all the way up to Supreme Bone Storm. Ironically enough, you actually don't need this point either. I'm just going to go ahead and take that out and put that back up into here. You know, actually stay along with what I'm saying. Technically speaking, that crit chance does help to be able to scale Shadow Blight. So at the end of the day, it's not completely lost on us. It's not like it's a dead stat. But if I'm going to say you don't need crit chance, I'm going to fully commit to it. For the Paragon boards, we are going with an additional glyph here. So I'm using Sacrificial, Abyssal, Scourge, Darkness, Exploit, and Control. You can check out the build planner to see the exact point allocations. For the minion version of the build, just like I kind of alluded to earlier, one, we don't really need Blood Mist when we can use a Golem. The Golem sacrifice isn't particularly valuable for us, but what we can do is use Iron Golem, which will now pull in monsters whenever it does its slam attack, and then it will stun them as well. It no longer applies vulnerable, but the pull in should act as a really good additional CC effect and our Blight pull to basically permanently keep control of the entire battlefield, depending on what the context is. The other interesting part about this is that I truly believe with that much CC, you basically don't need Lidless Wall, on top of the fact that when you have a Golem and you do Bone Storm, they also proc a Bone Storm. So you basically have 2 Bone Storms up the entire time, which is basically what you were hoping to do with having Lidless Wall on the build in the first place. And then because we have that much CC, we can afford to run an offhand for additional cooldown reduction, more damage stats, and then on top of that, we get to add Plunging Darkness back onto the build. This is a huge multiplier of your overall DPS on a Blight build, since it's a 2.25 multiplier to Blight whenever you cast Bone Prison, and Bone Prison is going to reduce our cooldowns, and then on top of that, Bone Prison will reduce the cooldowns for Golem. So with the addition of Bone Prison, we're able to proc our cooldowns more effectively, have more cooldown reduction, have more damage output. But you might have noticed something, one part of the puzzle here. If Bone Prison is applying our vulnerable, that's super sick. The Golem isn't applying our vulnerable, and we don't have corpse tendrils anymore. But with the void on the build like it naturally is, whenever we cast Bone Prison, that will also pixel pull all of the monsters. So we've basically lost nothing. You'll also be able to put Lucky Hit Chance apply vulnerable on your gear very easily on a build like this, since it has incredibly high Lucky Hit Chance. So I think all in all, being able to put the Golem onto the build gives you a new way of playing that's a bit more interactive. You don't need to fully invest in it to keep it alive, and it lets us output more damage than the previous build would allow for. For the other sacrifices though, we're still sacrificing Reapers for the additional shadow damage and then Bone Mages for the vulnerable damage. The skill tree is going to look a little bit different, only insofar as that we need to invest into Bone Prison all the way down to Dreadful Bone Prison for the cooldown reduction. We end up taking those last 2 points that we originally had in Death's Embrace and moving them back over to here. And then we also regained 3 of the points from Corpse Tendrils. The only thing that I need to change is taking this out and moving this back over to here. Bada bing, bada boom. There's also a universe where your Golem won't be able to survive enough. I think that you should be able to crowd control enough where it can, but if it cannot, you instead need to take these points back out of here and move them down into here and probably end up losing like 1 point from Reaper's Pursuit. So it has a decent health pool that you don't need to worry about. For the Paragon boards, we are using Sacrificial, Abyssal, Control, Scourge, and Darkness. And you'll also notice that in the Cult Leader, we are actually using Amplified Damage. This is still going to increase the amount of damage reduction that you get from the magic nodes, as opposed to having to use a Dead Razor glyph, which ultimately wouldn't do too much for us as a way of proactively proccing damage bonuses. Moving on to Sever build, there were a couple interesting things to generally figure out about this as the best ways of increasing its damage output. Most notably, I like to build Sever with Black River as well as Sacrilegious Soul, but I wanted to try out a couple different things here just so that we can make sure that the build is functional as it starts, and then later on when you have better gear and better resource management, you could swap over to things like Starless Skies and Essence Gen, and then put Black River back onto the build. For the non-minion version of it, we're using Juggernaut for the armor, we're using Shielding Storm for the barrier, we're using Ultimate Shadow to turn Bone Storm into a valuable asset. We're still using Tybalt's Will. Tybalt's Will is only going to give us a 20% damage bonus, but it has DR to close as well as flat damage bonuses. And then a little bit of maximum resource does help you to just generally cast more Severs, but it's still going to give you a huge amount of resource whenever you gain Unstoppable, and it's hard to say no to that. We do get to use Greaves of the Empty Tomb, which is actually pretty cool since DR is going to be a much more rare stat. These boots come along with DR on them, on top of added the Desecrated Ground aspect to Sever, which just helps with generally propagating Blight, as well as propagating Lucky Hit Chance from the base effect of Sever itself. We're going to use Damned again as a huge multiplier, and we need to basically fit this in. That's why I'm not currently using Black River. And then we're putting Blighted onto our amulet. My assumption is that we will reach crit cap without needing to use Grasping Veins in our amulet like you used to on Sever. If that's not the case, you would swap it up to here. Sacrilegious Soul to automate all of our corpse explosions, and then Exposed Flesh for the essence generation. Again, in the end game, you shouldn't need this for essence gen, and you'd be able to put Black River back onto the build and move Damned up over to here. Or if essence isn't an issue, but crit is, put Grasping Veins back onto the build. And then lastly, Lidless Wall for all the survivability that you need on Sever. For sacrifices, Reaper Skeletons, Cold Mages, Iron Golem. Nothing too crazy in the skill tree. We don't care about our generator, maxing out Sever with Sever applies vulnerable, maxing out Huge Flesh, and then imperfectly balanced. Again, just 1 point into Blood Mist. I'm only putting 1 point into Corpse Explosion and then triggering Blighted Corpse Explosion. We are a crit damage build. Damage over time doesn't crit, so we're only using this for the utility of it, and then the ability to use the Corpse Consumption package along with Fueled by Death. If you're having essence issues, you can pull out some points from other places to be able to put it into Grim Harvest. Then we're putting in Decrepify with Abhorrent, Amp Damage, and then obviously Death's Embrace. Here I am maxing out every single thing in the Shadow passive tree, and you'll notice that we're not actually putting points into Corpse Tendrils. The idea here is that we can afford to take the points out since we should be applying Vulnerable with Sever at a near consistent rate. If it turns out that we're not, you would have to pull out 3 points, and I think probably most notably the crit chance down here if it turns out that we don't need it, or pulling the points out of Death's Embrace to be able to pick up the vulnerable. And then we are still maxing out Standalone, Memento Mori, and then maxing out Bone Storm and Shadow Blight. For the Paragon board, this one's a little bit insane, and there's probably some room to be able to consolidate a little bit, but this is to get the maximum amount of total damage, as well as the damage reduction from darkness, which is really, really valuable. But we're using Sacrificial, Exploit, Abyssal, Amplify, Control, Essence, Darkness, and Scourge. 8 glyphs. Get some. It's honestly, it's sick that you get to do this on these builds. You're going to see it in Infinimist as well, and I think it's just like my peak design of a Paragon board. The minion version of the build, we basically get to benefit from the fact that we get to take a cult, adding on 4 more additional minions, and then changing the benefit of Sever over to gain a multiplier according to how many minions that we have. On top of that, since we are going to be scaling our crit chance continuously, we get to use crit minions, and then the shadow mages that say increase your damage by how many mages you have, so that we don't actually lose out on the multiplier there. We just have a flat multiplier even if we don't apply vulnerable. So for this setup, we're using Juggernaut for the armor, a cult for the +4 minions in total, ultimate shadow still, shielding storm on the pants, and then we're using Greaves of the Empty Tomb as well. You notice that we can't fit Tybalts onto here since we need the survivability aspects. If it turns out that we don't, you can put Tybalts back on. Still damned on the weapon, still running Blighted on the amulet, Sacrilegious Soul to automate everything, on top of the fact that this will be our primary way of consuming corpses via Raised Skeleton, which is going to replace Corpse Explosion in its entirety. Exposed Flesh, again for the essence if we still need it, and then Lidless Wall for the survivability to round it all out. Here, you'll notice that we've swapped out Corpse Explosion to the Raised Skeleton to, again, support the corpse consumption and be able to actually run the minions themselves. We continue to sacrifice the Iron Golem down here in the Book of the Dead. The major difference in the skill tree here is that we needed to find the points to be able to run our minions, and that meant that we could take the 6 points out of here to make that happen. And then since we needed a source of vulnerable again, since our Sever will no longer apply that for us, we took the 3 points out of Corpse Explosion and put them into Corpse Tendrils instead. For the Paragon board, most notably, since we can't use the Sacrificial Glyph, we have to swap this over to Scourge Glyph, which still gives us a 1.1 damage multiplier, as well as increasing our Shadow Blight damage as an additional multiplier from a shadow damage over time. And then again, in the Cult Leader board, we are swapping over to Dead Razor so that they actually have enough survivability to stand on their own. Onto the Infinimist Necromancer. This is probably one that I'm the most excited to try out since we're gaining such a huge additional ability to apply shadow damage over time from Ebon Piercer, the Blighted Amulet, which we're going to use here to be able to apply a huge amount of multiplicative damage and proc Lucky Hit. And then on top of that, be able to scale X-Fall's damage proc rate by that much more, since each one of our Blights should theoretically be able to trigger Lucky Hit off of each one of the additional projectiles, since it is created from using that skill, similar to how the Deathless Visage allows you to trigger Lucky Hit from the explosions left behind whenever you cast Bone Spear. The interesting part about it, though, is that I don't think that we can realistically fit on Ring of the Sacrilegious Soul, which might be a huge no-no. I'm trying to run Damned on the build. If it turns out that you just can't get away with it, I would swap right back over to Sacrilegious Soul, but I am trying to eke out as much damage as possible here. So we are using Explosive Mist on the helmet to be able to trigger Corpse Explosion proactively in Blood Mist, very similar to the old classic approach to playing the build. Shielding Storm for the barrier, we're using Blighted for the huge damage modifier, Juggernaut for the armor, Ghostwalker for our boots, Ultimate Shadow on our wand, and then we're using Blood Soaked, which also got buffed to be able to increase your movement speed by 20%, because we're, again, fitting Damned onto the build for a last multiplier if we can manage it, and I think that this should generally output much more damage than it was previously. Book of the Dead sacrifices here, again, Reapers for shadow damage, Cold Mages for vulnerable damage, and then our Iron Golem for crit damage. Never forget the fact that Infinimist is a crit damage proc build. It is not a Corpse Explosion build at all in the end game, so we're not really looking to do shadow damage over time or scale it. We want to be critting for as much damage as possible. Skill tree here, we're going to just put the 1 point into Blight just so we can get Supernatural for its multiplier, 3 points into Hued Flesh to make as many corpses as possible, Blood Mist to generate corpses as well, just the single point into Corpse Explosion up to Blighted just to be able to trigger Lucky Hit, as well as get our Shadow Blight procs in as fast as possible. We are putting the 3 points into Fueled by Death. You should not need additional Essence Gen with Grim Harvest. Obviously, building down into Decrepify and Abhorrent Decrepify, that's our bread and butter. Maxing out Amp damage, maxing out Death's Embrace, maxing out Death's Approach. We may not need those points, at which point I would actually take them out and put them into Blood Mist to reduce its cooldown. But at least for right now, since we can afford it, we're putting those in. Maxing out everything in the Shadow passives, most notably maxing out Crippling Darkness, since this is a huge instance of damage, and it even outperforms Shadow Blight. So like, or at least like the base version of Shadow Blight. So this is going to be a massive increase in our overall damage. Corpse Tendrils to be able to apply Vulnerable, and then we are still maxing out Crit Chance from Inspiring Leader if we need it, maxing out Bone Storm with Crit Chance, Standalone, and then Memento Mori, along with Shadow Blight obviously as our key passive here. If you watch the Sever build, you're going to see a very similar Paragon board here. Sacrificial, Exploit, Abyssal, Amplify, Scourge, Essence, Control, and Desecration to round it all off. This is only usable if we're using the blood-soaked aspect, so if you're not using it on your build, swap this out for something else. The minion version of the build is interesting in that it can really only afford to include a golem. In the past, I have made Infinimist minion builds, and the reason why those were so powerful is because Mendeln was based off of lucky hit chance, and now it's based off of scaling the attack speed of your minions more powerfully than it was previously on Infinimist, and then on top of the fact that it's just not a lucky hit effect anymore. So I think in this regard, realistically, fitting in the golem as a replacement for Corpse Tendrils is one of the only things that really made sense here, but we're continuing to sacrifice our Reapers for the shadow damage as well as Cold Mages for the vulnerable damage. There is no change to any of the aspects or the gear that you're wearing, including the unique items. But what Iron Golem brings to the table is when every single time that it slams, it will pull monsters in and stun them. So this is basically replacing the effect of the Corpse Tendrils on the build normally, and then on top of that, basically giving us a way of proccing Unstoppable without having to use Blood Mist, just in case it hasn't come off of cooldown in some kind of redundancy pattern where you're just getting like chain CC'd or something. The Keen-Eyed Watcher again will ask the question where you're getting vulnerable. Remember that they've added the affix lucky hit chance apply vulnerable, which means that we should basically have permanent vulnerable uptime since Infinimist is the strongest lucky hit chance build that the Necromancer has to offer. For the skill tree, every single thing is the same, except that we pulled the 3 points out of Corpse Tendrils to be able to put them into Golem Mastery so it actually has a chance to survive. The big changes on the Paragon is that since we have a minion at all, we have to swap over to Territorial. It's going to give us a little bit of a decent damage boost here, but most notably, it's also going to get us 10% DR, which is even more valuable now that DR is in less supply. And then we swap over Cult Leader to Dead Razor to give him the chance to actually survive without having to invest anything more into the Golem itself. We are now in the home stretch. We're looking at the bone builds here. We're going to start off with Bone Spear just because the other two builds are a little bit derivative from it, but the base Bone Spear build without Uber Uniques doesn't really look altogether that much different than what it would look like in Season 3 as it currently stands. We're going with a really simplified approach to being able to play the build to make sure that it is functional. Deathless Visage for everything that does, Juggernaut for the armor, we're going with Splintering on our gloves, Shielding Storm for the barrier gen, Wind Striker for mobility, we're putting Grasping Veins on our weapon. If we don't need Grasping Veins, we can swap this out to a different multiplier, but in reality, the 1.4 against bosses is just kind of really hard to beat as far as aspect slots are concerned, at least until you have Uber Uniques like Starless Skies where you need to rip aspects off of this build. For the amulet, Serration, Exposed Flesh to be able to generate essence, and then Torment to be able to generate essence as well. If essence is fine, you can run Conceited for the additional multiplier there pretty easily. And then Lidless Wall here to wrap it all out. Continuous Bone Storms, that's just what Bone Spear does, right? For the sacrifices, we would go with Skirmishers with Crit Chance if we need it. If we don't need it, you can sacrifice Defenders for res and then not have to worry about putting res into your jewelry so you can get some more armor onto your build. Cold Mages for vulnerable, Iron Golem for crit damage. Skill tree is pretty par for the course here. I am actually using Bone Splinters to be able to get additional crit chance again if you need it. If you don't, it's actually very easy to put on Shattered Spirit onto this build and then put on Bone Spirit literally just to generate essence. That gets closer to the hybrid though. At the very least in the end game, you probably shouldn't need that. Obviously maxing out Bone Spear, I am going with Supernatural Bone Spear to be able to apply vulnerable. It just really sucks not having vulnerable up on a single target. If lucky hit chance to be able to apply vulnerable is strong enough, you can very easily swap this out down to paranormal Bone Spear because Bone Spear has such a high lucky hit chance. Maxing out Unliving Energy along with Imperfectly Balanced, I only have 2 points into Hued Flesh here, just to be able to generate corpses against bosses proactively. Similarly, we have Blood Mist generates corpses to be able to do that in case you want to start the fight off with Grasping Veins already applied. Decrepify down to Abhorrent Decrepify. The cooldown reduction isn't super important. We had the points to spare, and most notably, the damage reduction from Decrepify is going to become incredibly more important in this season. Maxing out Death's Embrace for the DR whenever a target actually gets within melee range of you. I've just generally started doing this on Bone Spear because it turns out you're only ever really in damage when monsters jump on top of you, and that means that they're close to you. Death's Approach, obviously, for the huge amount of movement speed. We're not picking up any points into Rapid Ossification, but we are maxing out every other bone passive. Vulnerable from Corpse Tendrils, like normal. Picking up the crit chance from Inspiring Leader if you need it. Bone Storm, Standalone, and then Memento Mori with Ossified Essence to wrap it all out. The Paragon board is looking to get as much damage out of it as possible, so here we're using Corporeal, Imbiber, Sacrificial, along with Amplify, Essence, and Exploit. Interestingly enough, for the minions build, I think that you could fit all of the minions on it that you could possibly want. So we're using golems and skeletons here. For those, just because I want to touch on them very quickly before we move on, the skirmishers that say whenever you crit, they crit, and they get a crit multiplier, you're going to crit every single time you cast Bone Spear. So these things should basically permanently be critting, which is awesome. And then we're using the Bone Mages with the change that says that they will cast Bone Spear 25% of the time. What does that mean? I don't know. It's crazy. Will it absorb the Deathless Visage effect? I don't think so, but maybe. That would be pretty cool. Basically just more Bone Spears. I think it's ultimately going to be mostly a meme, but it's going to be cool as hell until we figure that out. And then here, we're actually picking up Iron Golem does its slam attack that does additional damage. They have vastly increased the rate that this happens and also vastly increased how much damage it does. And then this will help out with our single target damage, which oddly enough is kind of Bone Spear's weakest point. Yes, you do good single target damage, but it's not nearly as fast as other builds that can add on more multipliers at the detriment of decreasing their overall clear speed through density. And this is just a really decent way to be able to increase our overall damage output, which the skirmishers are also going to help with. Very minor changes to the gear here, but Deathless Visage on the helmet, still using Juggernaut. We do need to put a cult somewhere onto the build, so this is where we're going to get our 2 additional skeletons and 2 additional mages. We're going with Bone Storm for the additional barrier, Wind Striker for the movement speed. We're putting Splintering down onto our weapon, assuming that we do not need Grasping Veins for critical strike chance. Serration on our amulet, still Exposed Flesh as well as Torment. If you do not need the Essence Gen from Torment and you do need the crit chance, you would put Grasping Veins back onto here and then Lilith's Wall to round it all out. Slight change to our Paragon boards here. We're using Corporeal, Amplify, Essence, Exploit, and Imbiber, and instead we're swapping over to running Dead Razor in the Cult Leader board so that they will actually be able to survive without any additional investment, or at least that's the hope. I think out of all of the builds that have minion alternatives or minion variants to them, I think that this one is probably the most exciting. One, it's just going to look absolutely crazy nutty, and that's why I think a lot of people are going to be looking forward to it. But I also believe that the minions are like quite literally performing a function here that they otherwise can't perform on that build, which is finding a way of increasing single target damage without continuing to exacerbate the issue of only increasing AoE damage. Here, I think they both serve a purpose and they're going to look cool as all hell. If it turns out that the Bone Mages are just like a super meme though, swap over to Shadow Mages so that they just increase damage for existing bare minimum, and then you're not losing out on as many multipliers that you would normally get from the Book of the Dead. Bone Spirit was already just in a really good place. I'm not sure that there's too much changes to it that you should really expect. The very cool part about what they did to Bone Spirit is that it can basically manage its own essence without having to worry about anything else. And you get to use things like Bone Prison to further increase your ability to not have reliance on other essence generators, but also to be able to like proactively crowd control monsters and then also gain additional vulnerable procs, which was something that you basically had to use Reap and then Corpse Tendrils to accomplish in the past. And now I don't think that you really have to. And in season 3, at the very least, you definitely didn't have to. Juggernaut for the armor, we're using Shielding Storm for the barrier, Swelling Curse to basically make it so that we have 100% crit chance even if they didn't change anything else in the game. And then that increase to maximum essence basically means that every other cast of Bone Spirit, once against the pack and then once against a boss, are going to have huge damage multipliers attached to them and just overall increase the efficiency of the build that much further. We are able to use Tybalt's Will for the multiplier, the maximum essence on the pants as well, and then the additional essence generation whenever we use Unstoppable from Blood Mist, just in case you need it. Wind Striker on the boots, obviously. Then we're using Grasping Veins on our weapon. You may not need this. It's still one of the best multipliers, especially against a boss, so it's kind of hard to beat this on a Bone Spirit build. Serration on the amulet, Torment for more essence gen, and then Shattered Spirit to be able to generate an insane amount of essence. Basically, once you evade into a boss monster that's large enough, you can permanently spam Bone Spirit with this, since all of the bone shards will all hit the boss simultaneously and refill your essence immediately. Lidless Wall isn't as functional on a Bone Spirit build, but it basically means that you're going to leave behind storms whenever you move forward, so you at least get the benefit of the DR in the crit chance, and then every once in a while straggler monsters will run into it and generate barrier for you. They also claim to have fixed the fact that bone splinters from your Shattered Spirit wouldn't inherit the modifiers from the skill tree. If it does work, the point here in Initiate's Bone Splinters just means you have a little bit of better uptime on vulnerable against single targets when you haven't had like Bone Prison on cooldown and also somehow had Corpse Tendrils off cooldown, but it's not really that huge. We had the point to spare, so you might as well. We are maxing out Unliving Energy as well as Imperfectly Balanced. You don't need Hued Flesh here. You can't like proactively generate corpses against targets. Don't worry about it. Just the 1 point into Blood Mist to be able to proc the Unstoppable whenever you need it. Bone Prison with Bone Prison reduces cooldown. Since Bone Prison is also a bone skill, it reducing its own cooldown, Bone Storm's cooldown, and Bone Spirit's cooldown is phenomenal. Later on in the tree, we also have Rapid Ossification, which says whenever we cast Bone Spirit, reduce Bone Storm, Bone Prison, and Bone Spirit's cooldown even further. So you can basically permanently spam this thing as long as you have Essence to cast it with. Death's Embrace, Death's Approach, Amplify Damage, Decrepify with Abhorrent Decrepify. This isn't super relevant, but again, we have the points, so you might as well. Corpse Tendrils with Applying Vulnerable, maxing out Bone Spirit. If you have 100% crit chance, which is very easy to reach on Bone Spirit, then you go with Dreadful Bone Spirit to basically fix your essence generation. If not, you do have to use a crit chance, but you basically shouldn't have to. Like I said, maxing out everything down here except for Serration, which again, you shouldn't need the crit chance for this because we have easy crit chance in Inspiring Leader, which is not based off of how much essence you have on cast, since you basically want to be able to cast Bone Spirit all the time. Sometimes you're not at max essence, so you can't rely on this crit chance, but then standalone, Memento Mori, and then everything in Bone Storm, along with Ossified Essence. Paragon boards here, pretty simple: Corporeal, Sacrificial, Amplify, Imbiber, Exploit, and Essence to top it off. For the minion version of Bone Spirit, I think that realistically you can only afford to put a Golem onto your build, and it basically replaces your Unstoppable effect. One, to be able to benefit from Tibalt's more often, be able to proactively crowd control targets, give you another pull so it's easier to hit your Bone Spirit like mega nukes all over like really condensed monster packs, and you're not really giving up that much of a multiplier here. While it is a strong multiplier, when its only weakness is just like consistent clear speed, and even that's not that bad, the Golem is going to help out with that, whereas the damage was mostly overkilling monsters. The other interesting thing that I did change out just because we had room to do it is I did put hulking onto the build just to give your Golem a chance to reduce its cooldown more often so that you can proactively trigger Tibalts whenever you want. It's probably not that good, but we had the space, so like why not? Juggernaut for the armor, Shielding Storm for the barrier, Tibalt's Will Still, Wind Strikers for the crit chance movement speed, Grasping Veins on the weapon, Lidless Wall, we put Shattered Spirit here, we put Swelling Curse on the ring, assuming that you don't need Torment or Exposed Flesh, and then Serration on the amulet. Like you've seen previously, the Paragon boards are mostly changing to be able to include Dead Razor in the Cult Leader board, so we're using Corporeal, Amplify, Essence, Imbiber, Exploit, and Dead Razor. Alrighty, we hit the last build that I have for you today. This is the Bone Spirit Hybrid. The big thing here, and something I should have touched on the Bone Spirit build, is that they made so that Bone Spirit is considered a core skill, so we're able to get more bang for our buck more easily from the skill tree, and we aren't as penalized for building into the hybrid as we were before, when a lot of the skill points were just going to empower Bone Spear, and Bone Spirit was mostly a mana battery that helped with single target damage. Now they basically meld together in a much more strong combination of skills and total multipliers available to you. And then basically to be able to make room for everything, we don't use a generator at all. We're not using Bone Splinters, and you really shouldn't need it in all honesty. Deathless Visage to continue to empower both Bone Spirit, but most notably Bone Spear, Juggernaut for the armor, Splintering on the gloves, Shielding Storm on the pants, Wind Striker on the boots, Swelling Curse on our weapon here as opposed to Grasping Veins, Serration on the amulet, still Exposed Flesh so that we can maintain high uptime of essence while casting Bone Spear, and then Shattered Spirit so we can maintain high essence between fights and on bosses most notably, Lidless Wall to wrap it all up and to keep us safe. For the sacrifices, continuing to sacrifice skirmishers. If you don't need the crit chance, swap it down to defenders, and then swap your amulet and rings over to skulls for more armor. We're doing cold mages for the vulnerable, and then iron golem for the critical strike damage here. For the skill tree, it's going to get a little bit slim just to be able to fit everything in, but we have Bone Splinters and only the 1 point, so we don't get all the way up to the final evolution of Bone Splinters here. Unliving Energy and Imperfectly Balanced are both max. We're still maxing out Bone Spear, and you'll notice I'm still using Supernatural until you have some other way of generating Vulnerable, which might be on your stat, or which might be on your gear now. You could then swap over to Paranormal, but until then, I'm just going to recommend using this since it's very consistent for damage output against a single target. Just the 1 point into Blood Mist, maxing out Death's Embrace, maxing out Death's Approach, Amplify damage, and then only 1 point into Decrepify. We don't really need the cooldown reduction like I said previously, so we're able to tear out some points from that. Corpse Tendrils to be able to apply Vulnerable, maxing out Bone Spirit along with Dreadful Bone Spirit for the essence management. The same thing down here, except we could only afford 2 points into Rapid Ossification, but maxing out Compound Fracture as well as Avulsion, and we only need the 1 point in Serration. We currently have the 3 points in Inspiring Leader. If you don't need the crit chance, you can put 1 point back up into here and then 2 points somewhere else. I don't know. Blood Mist for the cooldown. Why not? You know, we're playing silly here. Bone Storm with everything that does. Standalone, and then Memento Mori with Ossified Essence to round that out. Into the Paragon tree. It's going to be very similar to what you saw before, but Imbiber, Corporeal, Sacrificial, Amplify, Exploit, and Essence. For the minion version of the build, I would love to be able to apply our skeletons here. I don't think it's really worth it for what you lose from the functionality of Bone Spirit to be able to make it so that bone mages are just randomly casting out bone spears. If it turns out that even if you don't scale their damage, they're somehow casting your bone spears, I would find a way to fit it into the build over the Golem, but we're using Blood Golem most notably for its damage reduction here. They changed the Blood Golem to make it so that it does 30% damage reduction, and it is really hard to find enough damage reduction on the Necromancer as it is. Absolutely nothing changes with the gear and the aspects from this setup versus the base setup. So Deathless Visage, Juggernaut, Splintering, Shielding Storm, Wind Striker, Swelling Curse, Lidless Wall, Shattered Spirit, Exposed Flesh, Serration. For the Paragon boards, we're going Corporeal, Amplify, Essence, Imbiber, Exploit, and then Dead Razor in Cult Leader to give it a chance to survive. Oh boy howdy, that sure was a ton of builds. Hopefully I managed to cut it down to a reasonable amount. Again, just like check every single timestamp for the build that you want in particular. Come join the Discord. The link is down in the description if you want to come see all of the build guides in the Discord, as I will be updating them and keeping them up to date, etc. with my findings as I go about playing the PTR itself. This will absolutely be the best place to find it, so please come join. You can access it via desktop if you don't want the app. I'm not going to be offended. But there you go. What do you think? I hope that this gives you some guidance on what to even take a look at in the PTR. Again, these are my best guesses. This is just kind of like what my gut reaction is telling me. These will make sense. These will be viable. At the very least, they are good scaffolding to then iterate on and optimize and come up with what the builds actually look like. Any research that you do or any findings that you come to, please share them in the Discord, comment on this video, come join the live streams either on YouTube or on Twitch. I stream on both. I'm going to be streaming as many hours a day as I possibly can. I do have a day job in the morning, but basically from like 12 p.m. ET till I pass out at night is how long I'm going to be playing the PTR and testing stuff. But if you find things that you're like, hey, you didn't cover this, it works really well, share them with me. The more testing that we do during the PTR and the more feedback that we give them, the better the end result will be and the better these guides will be for future players once the season comes around. So I'd love to hear from you. You're not bothering me. Hit me up wherever you can on social media. I won't be offended. If you're brand new here and you're like, hey, I appreciate this level of detail and amount of time that you've spent on this. It's now what? 11:27 p.m. the day before the PTR, and I have a day job. If you appreciate it, consider subscribing to the channel. At the very least, leaving a like on this video. It'll help me out a lot to get it into the algorithm so that more nerds see this, so they have a better idea of what to try out in this PTR, so they're not wasting their time doing ineffectual builds or just like not really hitting the nail on the head. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that everybody is able to play the PTR as much as possible so we can get as much feedback into the hands of Blizzard as possible. But I appreciate you being here. I hope to see you in the next video, and good luck with your testing.